Hello guys, I'm José Mayubi. I'm from Brazil. Today I talk about Professor Brown and my co-host Fábio Felix. So first, I would like to thank Professor Fábio Felix support this interview. I would like also to Professor Bernard Kops from sharing my interview, especially to ones with Professor Julianas and Professor Susan Hack. I'm also grateful to Professors Denis Coutinho and Professor Newton de Oliveira Lima from continuous support to my new projects. Flávio, presentation.
Stephen, I'm Flávio Villegas. I'm professor at the Federal University of Santa Maria. I teach ethics and philosophy of emotions. I really honored and proud to talk with you to have this conversation. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. The pleasure and honor is all mine.
It's an honor having you here, Professor Zhao. So, guys, a brief introduction, Professor Trevor Zhao, especially in Brazilian audience. So, Professor Zhao is a current professor of philosophy at Yale University. He is one of the most renowned philosophers in the field of moral philosophy. My favorite your books is The Bridget Morality and International Art, especially you talk about scribe about Hudson. I like so much modern moral philosophy from Grotius to Kant, and his two books about the second person standpoint, sorry, and morality, authority, and law. So, Professor Joel, looking back to your intellectual journey, how would
Mhm.
you assess development of your moral philosophy from the publications of Impassional Reason into your more recent work? And what do you see, what do you see as the most significant shifts or continues your thinking over the course of your career?
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that question. Yeah, I could start even farther back, actually, when I was a kid. And my father was an Episcopalian clergyman, and I was wondering about whether God was necessary for morality. And I decided, no, actually, he's not. That sort of set me on my journey of saying, okay, so what is it grounded in? Um, Okay, so by the time of impartial reason, so I wrote, that's based on my dissertation at the University of Pittsburgh, written under Kurt Beyer, but also with Jerry Schneewind. And I think John Cooper was a reader as well. Um, so there I was interested in reasons for acting, what we today we call normative reasons for acting. What makes something a normative reason? And interested in issues about what's called internalism and externalism. That is, what is the connection between both the existence of a normative reason and motivation on the part of the person for whom it's supposed to be a reason, but also that's what I call existence internalism, the idea that there has to be a necessary connection there. And then there's what I call judgment internalism. That's about the states of mind of having a view or opinion or a judgment about what there is a reason to do. And then the question is, can you judge that without having some form of motivation? And judgment internalists say yes, and judgment externalists say no. So I was interested in those kinds of questions, which I remain interested in, and also both interested in the history of those questions as I was investigating in the British Moralists and the Internal Law, which was published in the middle 90s. But in impartial reason, yeah, I'm interested in what reasons there are for acting, what makes something a reason for acting, what are, to put it the way Christine Korsgaard puts it, what are the sources of normativity? Um, and in particular, what what reasons do we have to be moral? And there the puzzle is one that H.A. Pritchard identified back in 1912 in a famous essay, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? So, of course, we can give self-interested reasons for being moral, but they run out at a certain point, and there's not necessarily a connection between self-interest. But even if there morality, but even if there were, it's not a grounding for morality. Morality is just a different kind of norm, has a different kind of normativity than just the normativity of reasons. Now, I hadn't quite seen at the point I wrote Impartial Reason, so that was based on my dissertation, which I did in 1972. Published, the book was published in 83. Um, that to really understand the distinctive normativity of moral obligation, you had to understand its connection to accountability and ultimately to what I call the second person standpoint. I thought what I was concerned with was in Impartial Reason is, do we necessarily have reason to be moral? Um, and I had an argument that we do, uh, and it was a very complicated argument and drove people crazy because, what's he saying here? I had all kinds of little acronyms and so on in the argument, and it was very hard to follow. Uh, I think there's something right about the argument even now, but I think it's much less important than the thing I went on to discover. So first, uh, we need to think about the word moral or morality. Um, I remember in the questions that you guys sent me, you asked various things about, well, is morality necessarily deontic and so on. Well, this I think is a matter of stipulative definition. Um, we can use words any way we like, but it's just a fact that beginning in the 17th century, with writers like Grotius, who's the beginning person that I discuss in Modern Moral Philosophy from Grotius to Kant, um, philosophers notice that there's this difference between what Francisco Suarez, called law on the one hand and counsel on the other. Counsel is a matter of good reasons. If I counsel you to do something, I say, look, there's just good reason to do this. Um, and I'm not trying to make any demand of you or say that anybody makes any demand of you or that morality makes a demand of you or that you're obligated in the sense that you'd be accountable for acting on this advice. It's just there's good reasons to do these things. But that's then contrasted with, on the other side, law. And law, Suarez said, and then Grotius goes on to say, is necessarily a matter of accountability. What I'm legally obligated to do is what I can be held accountable for. And so that's not just a matter of good reasons, that's a matter of what I come to call second personal reasons. And the reason for that is that accountability is in its nature second personal. To hold someone accountable, whether it's someone else or yourself, as in the feeling of guilt, is to address a demand to them. Um, and to do so in a way that bids for their recognition of the legitimacy of the demand and for their acknowledgement that they're obligated to follow the demand. And it also presupposes that they're able to follow the demand just because it's a legitimate demand. So it presupposes a distinctive kind of freedom as well. Okay, so that's the new element that I got onto back in the 1990s. The way this happened is kind of comic in a way. Uh, I was asked by Cambridge University Press to write a history of modern moral philosophy. They were just calling it, modern ethics. Okay. And of course, the phrase modern moral philosophy refers to the famous essay by Elizabeth Anscombe, called by the same name. And I agreed to do it and signed a contract. Um, and I thought, okay, well, I've written The British Moralist and the Internal Law in 1995. I know that period pretty well. I know the contemporary 20th century pretty well. I know Sidgwick pretty well. But I don't know a whole lot about Hegel and Fichte and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and so on. I don't know much about 19th century, first post-Kantian German idealism, and then these other figures. So I applied for a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities In those days, there was no Trump to say, okay, we're taking all funding away from the National Endowment for the Humanities. This is actually true that in 2023, I had a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which happily, Trump wasn't in power, and so he wasn't able to do what he did in 2025, which is to say, rescind all of those fellowships. So if I'd had a fellowship this year, then it would have been taken away. Okay, forget that little codicil. But I had this fellowship to read 19th century, mostly German post-Kantian idealism, Fichte, Hegel, and so on. And so I was reading Hegel, and I was reading this book by Alan Wood called Hegel's Ethical Thought, and he has a chapter on Fichte and Fichte on recognition, where he talks about this idea in Fichte of what Fichte calls a summons, or in German, an Aufforderung, which in my terms is a second personal address. It could be as simple as, would you please pass the salt? Or it could be, you must get off my foot because I have a right that you not be standing on my foot. And what Fichte said was, and he's just right about that, I came to see pretty quickly that he was right about this, is that when you address somebody in that way, you put them and you into what I now call the second person standpoint. That is, you just have to be presupposing certain things about them. And Fichte saw all this, actually. And I came to see later that Pufendorf and some other people saw a lot of this as well. That you just have to presuppose a relationship of mutual accountability. It's what Grotius calls sociability, um, that makes you accountable to each other and presupposes that you have certain capacities, the capacity to take up this standpoint and make a demand of yourself and hold yourself accountable to others and then them to you, but also presupposes that they have the authority, which you have as well, to hold others accountable. Okay, this is a long way of answering your question, but what I'm getting to is that I started off thinking that you could capture everything you needed to be captured about morality just in terms of reasons. I came to see that that's not right, that the normativity of moral obligation is not just that of reasons in general, it's that of second personal reasons, which always presuppose accountability, and so on. So yeah, that's sort of the journey there.
Great answer, Professor Troll. I like so much your response. Professor Troll, now I'll talk about your book, Modern Moral Philosophy Grotius to Kant. I like so much, especially your response, Elizabeth Ascobon challenge. So my question is, Professor Troll, what are your main response in the first volume of Modern Moral Philosophy to Elizabeth Ascobon's well-known criticism of moral philosophy?
Sorry, are you talking about Anscombe?
Yes, Elizabeth
Yeah,
Ascobon.
yeah, okay, good. Yeah, so we could start with Grotius. Okay, so first let's just be clear of what Anscombe's criticism was. Her criticism was that any, as she put it, law conception of ethics, one that involves culpability, accountability, and so on, the concepts that I argue all require the second person standpoint, that they can't make sense except in terms of the idea of a divine commander. So the normativity of the moral law is different from the normativity of, let's say, the law of Brazil, or the law of the United States. Those have a kind of restricted some normative power. They don't automatically generate moral obligations, but obviously morality automatically generates moral obligations. So she was saying, okay, but nonetheless, it has to require a lawgiver, a legislator, God, because it can't be an earthly one. It's got to be a transcendental one. So I think even though it's true that there are many, especially in the 17th century, modern moral philosophers, as I and Anscombe would both call them, who are uh, theological voluntarists. That is, they hold the divine command theory of law, namely that morality just consists in God's law, which has the normativity of a command that he has the authority to issue. Um, that's really not the dominant view, and it increasingly becomes not the dominant view. And so, for example, right at the very beginning with Grotius in The Rights of War and Peace, or The Law of War and Peace, depending on how you want to translate that, he's arguing that moral obligation doesn't depend upon God. So then what can it be grounded in? So that's really your question. Is there an answer here? And I think that when you really look at, I mean, this is the interpretation I give of Grotius, that it's a version of the interpretation of the view that I've come to myself. That is, Grotius says that the ground of what he calls the fountain of the natural law or right is what he calls sociability. What is sociability? Well, when you look at the work it's supposed to do in Grotius's framework, it's not just uh, wanting to hang out with other people or liking them or even loving them. It's being bound to them by relations of mutual obligation. Um, and the reason it has to be that is because Grotius not only accepts, but he proclaims this distinction that Suarez makes between uh, counsel on the one hand and law on the other. And he connects law to accountability in the way I was suggesting before. So that means that sociability has to involve what I would call both second personal competence and second personal authority. And that's the view I argue for in the second person standpoint, that whenever anybody makes a putatively legitimate claim or demand on some other person, they are just presupposing, they have to presuppose as a condition of the intelligibility of that putatively justified demand, both that the person on whom they're making the demand, this could even be oneself, as in the case of guilt, but typically another person, that they have what I call second personal competence. They have the capacity to reason within a shared, impartial, second personal standpoint. Uh, and they have the capacity that is to reason from within that standpoint to justify demands and to comply with those demands just because they're justified. So that's a distinctive form of freedom. It's what Cudworth calls uh, moral free will, as opposed to what he calls animal free will, which is a kind of capacity to act in your own interest, to step back from your pressing desires and form a view about what would be best for you to do on the whole. Okay, so and then the other thought is this is a play what I argue for in the second person standpoint, but I think it's also there in Grotius. I'm not sure he really knows it, but when you look at the texts, you see, well, he needs this assumption uh, that you presuppose not just the second personal competence of the person you're addressing and of you, the person who's addressing it, but also the second personal authority of the person to whom you're addressing the demand, and reciprocally of you as well. Um, so ultimately, I think that is so, I had argued in the second person standpoint that I, had an answer to Anscombe's challenge. Remember Gary Watson in his review of the book said that one of the most exciting things about the book is that if it works, it provides an answer to Anscombe's challenge. But in the book we're now talking about, Modern Moral Philosophy from Grotius to Kant, what I'm trying to do is how various of these modern moral philosophers have had aspects of this answer. I mentioned Grotius. Pufendorf is another example. Now, Pufendorf is himself actually a divine command theorist. He's a theological voluntarist. But when you look at the kind of moral psychology he thinks we have to have, and actually God has to have also, to be capable of entering into relations of mutual obligation, you'll see it's second personal competence. And then the point is that we have to be able to see for ourselves that we're obligated. So God has to presuppose a certain authority in us to hold ourselves accountable, not just to Him, but to ourselves as well. So Pufendorf's another example. There are bits of it in Adam Smith. There are bits of it in Thomas Reid, and so on.
Great answer. Professor John, I have a question about the difference in the classical modern, no, classical morality and modern moral morality. So, the ancient Greeks, broadly speak, held to a unified view of reason. In contrast, modern moral philosophy seemed to introduce a kind of dual extracurricular distinction between universe reason and the self-interest reason, or,
Yeah.
in simple terms, consequence consequences, sorry, and self-love.
Yeah.
Professor Dow, my question is, how would you describe this relationship between reason and morality within this shift? And in your view, what are the key differences between classical and modern conception this relationship?
Yeah, good. Um, so Sidgwick, of course, is the source of this quote that I that I quote at the beginning of the book. That is that in the among the ancient Greeks, there's just one principle, he says, under the title of reason, and he says it's something like self-love. Whereas in the moderns, and I love this phrase, once they have worked their ideas clear, they're found to be two. And you can describe these in various ways, either the right and the good, or morality and self-interest. Okay, so now what do I think are the relations? Um, well, again, let me just go back to that distinction we get from Suarez between reasons, normative reasons, and what we could call deontic reasons, reasons that come from moral obligation, that involve accountability, and hence culpability, lacking excuse. Um, so the difference is that one is essentially second personal and the other isn't. Um, and this is not just about self-interest. The same thing is true about other people's interests. So if I care for you, uh, if I have the attitude of caring towards you, you all must know Darle Dallagnol, what university is he at in Brazil? I forget, but he's written this thing on respectful care in bioethics. And so I tend to think that there's just a difference between respect and care. Care is a concern for the other person for their sake and treating them as a source of reasons, but not necessarily deontic reasons. Respect, though, necessarily brings in the deontic, that is the idea of duty and obligation and mutual accountability. Um, okay, so the real difference here is between reasons, pure and simple, good reasons. They could be self-interested reasons. They could be other interested reasons, interested about your welfare, for example, on the one hand, and on the other hand, matters of obligation, things that I am rightly held accountable for, and would be justifiably blamed for if I didn't do. Yeah, so that maybe I'll just mention one other thing. So even though there's this difference between second personal reasons or deontic reasons, reasons coming from obligation on the one hand, and just reasons to do something, normative reasons, I do think it's true, and this is something I was arguing for even back in my dissertation, that if you're morally obligated to do something, you necessarily have conclusive reason to do it, and you couldn't have sufficient reason to not do it. And the argument for that is one I give in a number of places. It comes really from, well, a number of people, but maybe the most surprising source of it is Bernard Williams in a paper called Internal Reasons in the Obscurity of Blame. And the basic thought is if I think it would be blameworthy for you to fit for, let's put it in my case, for me to fail to do something, then I'm saying I would fittingly feel blame towards myself if I were to do it. But I couldn't think that and at the same time think I had sufficient reason to do it, um, because that'd be a kind of contradiction. So it's a contradiction to say you really shouldn't have done that, but you had reason to do it. So since that's true, it just could not be the case conceptually that you could ever have sufficient reason to do what you're obligated not to do.
Okay, great answer, Professor Tall. Now I have a methodological question. Uh,
Yeah,
how does your approach to moral philosophy different from that of moral tradition scholar, for example, Terence Irving?
yeah. Well, I remember when I read the question as you posed it in that way. I don't think of Irwin's as more traditional. I think as Irwin's is a loner. He's completely alone against the tradition. So here's what Irwin thinks. Irwin thinks there is no real difference between ancient and modern moral philosophy or ethics. He thinks that all the great ethical philosophers worth paying attention to held a view he called Aristotelian naturalism. And Aristotelian naturalism is the idea that first it involves what he calls eudaimonism, or what Sidgwick calls egoism. That is, all reasons come from the agent's own good. Um, and that there are such reasons do to be moral. Why? Because what's morality? Well, that's a matter of doing what's for the common good. Okay, nothing about accountability, nothing about blame. So Anscombe can sign on to all of this, and so his great hero actually is Aquinas. Whoops, sorry. Uh, um, his great hero is Aquinas, who, when Suarez makes that distinction between law and counsel, he's basically saying Aquinas doesn't really have a theory of morality. He has because he lacks the law-like aspect because he doesn't connect it to accountability. Um, so Irwin's book came out in the early 90s, I guess. Or no, 2000s. Sorry, I'm keep getting a phone call here. Um, and uh, he was writing against people like Jerry Schneewind, John Rawls, Henry Sidgwick, Elizabeth Anscombe. All of those people think that there is an important difference in the modern period. Uh, so I don't think of that as the traditional view. Now, what do I think about the view? I think it's wrong. And I think the reason it's wrong is that it just doesn't account for this distinctive element, the deontic element of accountability. It runs right over this distinction that Suarez makes between law and counsel. So it never really gets to what's distinctive about morality. If we use morality to refer to the thing that Anscombe's arguing against, the thing that I'm arguing for, uh, and what is that? Well, it's a conceptual framework that has these elements of accountability, blameworthiness, um, and this implicit second personal relation. It's interpersonal in that way.
Professor Flavio, your questions right now.
I was very happy to talk with you when Jose invited me because I read your book and I
Say it again. Oh, there we go.
okay, so you can go on with your answer, please.
Yeah. Well, I think that's pretty much it. That they both involve affectivity, but they're different kinds of affectivity. Uh, I think you're right. You're certainly right that philosophers are much more skeptical about the heartfelt stuff than they are about the other
Yeah.
part. Yeah. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is to provide a philosophical framework in which to understand the heartfelt and to show that it's a very important part of our emotional life and of our ethical life. It's nothing that is a matter of obligation. Nobody can demand it of us. Neither can we demand it of ourselves. But it's of great importance.
Okay. Thank you. I have another question. I was translating your book today, and there is in the first chapter, you have a subsection about forgiveness. And
Yeah,
you said in a certain moment that forgiveness, I can forgive someone because I don't have more resentment. I'm just I don't take any more your offense, for example.
yeah,
But you said, but I can still be with a heart broken for
right,
so
right.
this my question is about this distinction because I recall a definition from Bishop Butler, and he says that forgiveness
Yeah.
is a change in the heart attitude.
Well,
So you think there is possible to make this distinction between
yeah,
like a
yeah,
say a more intellectual or more deontic
yeah.
forgiveness and a more personal or heartfelt kind of forgiveness?
Yeah, I think so. As I recall, Butler, he says it's forswearing resentment, right?
Yeah.
Now so that's what I'd call deontic forgiveness.
Ah, okay.
That that is, you no longer hold it against the other person. It's like, okay, I'm not going to sue you about this in
Yeah.
court. You've taken responsibility, and I'm satisfied. There's nothing more you have to do in order for me to be prepared to deal with you as another person. But that doesn't mean I have to let you into my heart. Uh, and so you can still have people who are still, let's say, profoundly hurt by what happened, that they just can't find it within themselves to do this other thing, which is heartfelt forgiveness. Um, and I'm pretty sure I've been in that situation. The person who's not being can't get heartfelt forgiveness, even though you know, I mean that's why it's a matter of grace. It's nothing that we can demand or earn.
Mhm.
So that's a central idea, I think, of Christianity, that God's love or Jesus's love, let's say, is a grace that we can't earn.
Okay. Thank you.
Professor Zhao, I'm really sorry again. Can you reschedule just the final part?
The interview
Ah,
again. So, Stephen, you mentioned, you quote, in fact, Iris Murdoch in your book, and
Yeah.
I really like a lot of the Iris Murdoch moral philosophy, and if you recall the sovereignty of good,
Oh, yeah.
she argues for like several chapters against the idea that we are like altruistic people. She has this idea of the fat ego, and we are all the time creating self imaging
Yeah.
to protect ourselves. So
Yeah.
uh, my question is about the your account of love,
Yeah.
because I think. But the question is basically if your account doesn't risk to idealizing love, because in everyday life, love is often entangled with neediness, dependence, and self-deception. And so the question is, how do you respond to the concern that love is shaped less by openness to the other and more by distortion of our
Yeah.
own affective psychology?
Yeah. Well, it's certainly true that love is something, well, this is actually is a Murdoch point.
Yeah.
Love is something that it takes care. Uh, in other words, I can't just love you. I have to be able to see you in the right way. Um, and I have to, in Murdoch's terms, unself myself. I have to get out of the business of this of what Loegstrup calls the self-enclosing fantasy. I forget exactly what Murdoch calls it,
Yeah.
uh, but it's the same idea: self-serving fantasies, like in the famous passage where she considers the mother and the son and the daughter, M, D, and the son, and so the mother starts off thinking about D, that she's a silly girl. But it's quite clear that what's going on is that she's telling herself this story because she fears loss of status, that her son's having married or gotten together with this woman uh, lowers his status and thereby her status. Okay, so I mean, all these emotions, the self-protective, the self-enclosing narratives, these are all within the space of what Rousseau called amour propre, where what we're concerned about is our image, both with respect to others, the way other people see us, and how we see ourselves. And the contrast for Murdoch is seeing others as they really are, or seeing the kestrel in her example as it really is, or in the painting's example, her idea is that beauty is something that also requires this loving attention.
Yeah.
Okay. Now,
So
my
your
criticism,
idea of love is like love requires a certain kind of attention and effort, and it's
yeah,
not
yeah,
just the natural or like the
right.
popular view
So,
of
so
love because it looks
right.
more.
Yeah. So to that extent, we're on the same page, she and I.
Okay.
Where my view departs from her view is that her view is from an observer's or spectator's perspective. It's an aesthetic view. So it's like I look at you, let's say, in the same way I might look at a kestrel or I might look at a painting, trying to see what's really there, okay, from an observer's perspective. For me, that's not second personal.
Mhm.
And there's nothing heartfelt in it. There's no opening of the heart. There's just the opening of the eyes, if you like. Having a clear-eyed view in which is objective. I try to abstract away from all my self-serving fantasies and so on. Okay, but that's still a third-person view. Now, it's what your question was, Flavio, was isn't my view idealistic in a way?
Mhm.
Uh, isn't, in fact, our love always entangled with these self-regarding fantasies? Surely it is. But what I think we're aiming at in love isn't. So for me really to open my heart to you, I have to be able to uh, I have to be able to unself myself, and I
Mhm.
have to be able not to be thinking of how you, whether you like me or not, or whether you adequately respect my work or whatever it is. I just have to be able to open my heart to you in a way that I could open it to a young child, for example. Be vulnerable to you and have be vulnerable to you as someone who can be vulnerable to me. So for me, there's this implicitly interdependent, intersubjective, mutual vulnerability, mutual open-heartedness that's just not there in Murdoch. And I have some guesses about why it's not. I mean, in fact, in her own life, I think I say this in the book, she was a very tender-hearted person. And um, there's, there's a wonderful book called The Women Are Up to Something, which is about Murdoch and Anscombe and Philippa Foot and Mary Midgley at Oxford during World War II. And it talks about Murdoch's childhood and how the headmistress of the school that she went to said, "You have to be very careful with Iris. She'll cry over anything." So she was incredibly emotional.
Mhm.
And, she had all kinds of very close, heartfelt relations and sexual relations with many, many people in Oxford, maybe including Philippa Foot. Or, I'm not sure that was actually requited, but her feelings were clear. Um, but for her, that was always a tempestuous, tumultuous way. She could never really sustain it. And the relationship she sustained, I mean, she sustained a relationship with Philippa Foot also, but that by that point was quite platonic and, philosophical and, just two friends. But her husband, John Bailey, they had a virtually uh, a relationship without sexual contact.
Mhm.
And I think that gave her solace. So I think it was just always, it was threatening to her
Mhm.
to be in this relationship of mutual emotional vulnerability. Now, that's just utter speculation. It has nothing to do with the validity of my view or her view, but it is just sort of puzzle about, well, why didn't she get this aspect? Because many people, I'm not the only person who said this about Murdoch. I just recently, oh, yeah, I know Sandy Deal, Sanford Deal, who teaches at NYU, has written a paper in which he says sort of the same thing about Murdoch. Um, yeah,
Okay. I have one more question about your book and another one more political. I will ask,
yeah,
I will leave the last to the final. Uh, this question is more because you mentioned James Baldwin and Audre Lorde and another a series of how can I say political philosophers and writers that are interested in the way social structures
yeah,
affect our way of feeling and living.
yeah,
And it's a very general question, but I want to understand better how do you see the role of social constraints and social practice in our uh, emotional responses. For
yeah,
example, love.
yeah,
Because if you are gay, for example, you have a very different emotional experience of love than straight people. And
yeah,
so, how do you see this social aspect? This
yeah,
is something that you don't mention in the book, but I'm
yeah,
curious
yeah.
about. Okay.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And let me take it in a slightly different direction. So the way you were taking it was sort of different styles, if you like, of loving
Mhm.
or what it is to love. Let's say gay males, lesbians, uh, straight men. Yeah, and even at different times. So I'm reading his biography, wonderful biography of a man named Charles Sumner, who was a leading abolitionist. He was a senator from Massachusetts before the Civil War, and he had very close relationships with other men, um, uh, especially Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Uh, and they would even sleep in the same bed together and they would hold each other and so on. I don't know if there was anything like what we would call gay male sex today, but that was, the author argues, that was not that unusual or anything that anybody would have frowned upon in those days.
Mhm.
At the same token, they didn't really have our notion of gay male sexuality. So these are things that are very much culturally and historically contingent. And I mean, just think of Socrates and Alcibiades uh, in ancient Greece. Okay. Now, the thing I think that's worth thinking about also is how attitudes towards love uh, affect social and political relations around gender. So I don't think there's any doubt that, care ethics came about in the 1980s from women. So Michael Sloat's written about them, but it was Carol Gilligan and Virginia Held and Nell Noddings. Anyway, so and the idea was that it was a distinctively women's perspective. Now, uh, even Gilligan said, I don't mean there's anything essential about this. It's just that this is the way that this is a different voice that I tend to hear from women and girls. Okay. So, and, emotional vulnerability is something that is more characteristic of relations that women are involved in than men. And so, so to the extent that the public sphere is a male sphere, I think that's less true now than it was when I was growing up, but it's still just, Trump seems to be making America, not so great again in that respect.
Yeah.
Returning to the sort of macho framework. Well, the macho ideal is not a loving ideal. It's okay, at best, mutual respect. Sometimes it's just, the law of the jungle, more of a sort of dominance hierarchy. Um, but I think that's very much a matter of gender, to the extent to which it's okay to be publicly loving and open-hearted.
Okay, thank you. It's another last question now about the climate, academic climate in US in these days,
Yeah,
because I heard that your colleague, the professor Jason Stanley, moved to Toronto because he has some concerns about the political
yeah,
climate in US. So how do you see the situation there?
yeah. Well, it's a perilous situation. I don't think there's any doubt about it. I mean, I'm not myself about to move to any place, but they're not sure there's any place that would have me. Uh, but uh, but Jason, I think, was in a special position for several reasons. First, he has young children that he's very concerned about growing up in, and his children are black as well. So he's concerned about them growing up in a place where they can thrive. Jason also has been very publicly vocal uh, on matters like fascism, and his most recent book is about, I think it's called A Miseducation.
Mhm.
It's about the way in which the right is trying to take over public education or completely marginalize it, with everything being a matter of, vouchers and private education. Universities, I think, are in the most difficult position. They've been certainly in my lifetime, and I can't imagine that they've been in a more difficult position before. Um, so Yale is not as threatened as Harvard or Columbia or Penn. I think that's purely through contingencies. We could equally well have been. Um, but I think just today, uh, a judge in Massachusetts is hearing the case between the Trump administration and Harvard. Harvard stands to lose a billion or a couple $1 billion. Yale, well, we'll have lost the NIH funding, National Institute of Health funding. I think that's something like $700 million a year. And we also will have to pay this tax on endowments of basically any institution of higher education that has an endowment that's above a certain amount in relation to the student number in the student body. And it was going to be, in the original House bill, that was going to be 21% on the earnings of the endowment, which would have been $700 million a year. Now it's going to be only 8%. I say only, and that's something like a third of it. So now the university has to come up with close to $1 billion per year in funding. How does it do that? It's not at all obvious. So there will be cuts. Yale, like almost every place now, has announced that there won't be that there will be staff cuts and there won't be hiring. I don't think Yale's talked about cuts yet, but we've talked about not hiring into new positions. But it's hard to believe that that can get all the money that is needed to balance the books. So and then just quite apart from that, from the funding side of it, I mean, the truth is, American higher education, even before Trump, had a very low standing with the American public, and that's part of what makes Trump possible, actually. That is this toxic relationship between the MAGA phenomenon on the one hand, and on the other hand, the people they see as having contempt for them. That is the educated East and West Coast intellectuals. I have a paper about this called The Wages of Contempt that talks about this phenomenon. It's just a completely toxic situation. But so what I was going to say, though, is even before Trump, but certainly this was part of the Trump phenomenon, even before Trump himself came on the scene, American higher education has a lower standing with the American public than any other institution, including the American Congress.
Wow.
So, we're in a very difficult position. So we still get great students. Um, we still get more applications than ever before for increasingly higher tuitions. I mean, tuition is going to have to go up, obviously, in this situation. Um, but yeah, it's more and more of an isolated situation. We don't have the same relationship to the society at large that we had at one point. And part of this is about the undermining of the very idea of expertise.
Mhm.
And it doesn't matter whether it's priests or doctors or authors or intellectuals. It's this sort of populism that runs through the Trump phenomenon. That's part of what's going on. And part of it also has to do with the way in which globalization has led to dramatic inequalities that have left behind a lot of people, working class people or unemployed people in this country, and that the Democratic Party hasn't been able to connect with them. So the Democratic Party is increasingly a party of the educated elites, and much less about labor unions. Labor unions were both, I think, the heart and soul of the Democratic Party, and also the heart and soul of America, 50 years ago. But they've been undermined largely through what we would call the Reagan Revolution, which happened when Reagan came in 1980, and ever since then. Um, and then the Democratic Party since politics is increasingly about money, uh, and public funding just is a drop in the bucket, doesn't count for anything when somebody like Elon Musk can come along and throw hundreds of millions of dollars yeah, that was all, forgetting the name of the Supreme Court case that made that constitutional. Anyway, yeah, it's a huge mess. I'm very depressed about it. Uh, I hope to live long enough. I don't expect to live long enough to see this be repaired. I mean, this is a kind of damage that you don't undo except in generations. So anyway, just all we can do is, resist and stand up for what we think is right and be happy that I mean, just be incredibly grateful that we are still able to meet with our students and have students and meet with colleagues. And here we are, doing this thing together. It's called philosophy, and it doesn't get any better than that.
Yeah, I regret to hear that. Yeah, so I hope you find a solution in the short
Yeah,
time. And
yeah, yeah,
Jose, do another question before Stephen. I met David Kopp in Davis a couple years
yeah,
ago. I know Peter Hilton also, Peter
yeah.
Railton, sorry,
Oh, yeah, yeah.
and I know you are friends. And I'm curious about your background. Like, for example, did you was a student of some well-known philosophers like Bernard Williams or
Yeah.
uh, maybe I don't know who was your teachers in
Well,
ethics.
my thesis advisor was Kurt Beyer.
Kurt
And
Weill, yeah.
you may not know the name, but in the middle 50s, 1957, he wrote a book called The Moral Point of View, which was a very important book at that time. And Rawls actually refers to it in the theory of justice and says that the view that uh, Beyer has there is as close to his as anybody else he knows. So Beyer was an important teacher of mine. Jerome Schneewind was also an important teacher of mine,
Kurt
who
Byers,
wrote
the husband of Annette Beyer.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
and Annette, I didn't have any classes with, but she actually gave me my first job. She was teaching that time not at Pitt, at University of Pittsburgh, but at Carnegie Mellon, and that was because Pitt wouldn't hire her, and this was just straight sexism.
Mhm.
Uh, but yeah, I got to know her very well, and then of course we knew each other very well later when she was working on Hume and I was working on Hume,
She is
and we
wonderful. Yeah,
yeah. But then
amazing.
the other people I really am indebted to, well, I mentioned, so the book Modern Moral Philosophy from Grotius to Kant has a dedication to Schneewind, to David Falk, W.D. Falk, who was a colleague of mine at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill,
Mhm.
and to William Frankena, who I never was really a colleague of, but who in some ways I replaced when I went to Michigan. So he'd retired from Michigan a couple of years before, and I'd known him. He spent a year, or maybe it's just a semester in North Carolina at the National Humanities Center near Chapel Hill.
Mhm.
And so I saw him then. And then when I went to Michigan, well, when I visited Michigan in 1982, he was there. And then he was there when I went there for good in 1984. And so I talked to him a lot and got a lot from him. Both actually all three of Schneewind and Falk and Frankena had a deep knowledge of the history of ethics. So I got that from them. The other person I don't dedicate it to, but who I could as well have added is John Rawls. And I was never a student of Rawls's, but I met him just after I got my PhD at Chapel Hill when he came to be part of the Chapel Hill colloquium. And we stayed in touch, and he'd send me things, and I'd send him things. And he was very, very helpful and very, very supportive. And of course, I'm a complete uh, fan of a theory of justice and employed the idea of the veil of ignorance. And I've written a lot about Rawls over the years.
Okay, thank you for that. José,
Thank
pode.
you.
Yeah.
No. It's finished. Thank you so much, Professor Zhao. It's an honor having you here. It's an honor talking to you. Thanks so much. Yeah. this interview. I great your answers. Yeah, I like so much your book.
Thank you. Will you send me a copy of the recording? Thank you guys both very much for this. It's been a great pleasure, and I've learned a lot as always.
Okay, thank you for
Thanks so much,
attending.
Professor.
Take care. Okay, have a good evening.
You're a gentleman, man.
Okay,
Okay,
bye-bye.
bye.
Bye bye.